My name is Caleb. My brother, Elias, vanished 3 months ago in the Great Smoky Mountains, right near the old settlements of Cades Cove. The police called it an unexplained disappearance. But I know the woods don't just eat people without a reason. I went back there to find him, thinking I was prepared for the wild. I wasn't. What I found wasn't a man or an animal. It was something that has lived in those mountains since before the first stones were laid. This is the recording of what happened during those final 48 hours. If you're listening to this, don't go looking for me. I pulled my truck onto the gravel shoulder of the Cades Cove Loop Road just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The air here is different, thick, humid, and smelling of damp earth and rot. I checked my gear one last time, my hands shaking more than I care to admit. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. Somewhere deep in those trees, my brother's trail went cold. I stepped over the boundary line, leaving the world of the living behind. The trail was overgrown, as if the forest was actively trying to hide the path. I found the first marker Elias mentioned in his last text, a stack of stones near a lightning-struck oak. It looked intentional, but the stones were covered in a slick, black lichen I'd never seen before. My flashlight beam cut through the growing gloom, revealing the jagged edges of the bark. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I felt 1,000 eyes watching me from the shadows. I stumbled upon a clearing where someone had clearly camped recently. A small nylon tent stood collapsed and shredded, its blue fabric flapping like a wounded bird in the breeze. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the remains of a life interrupted. I reached down to pick up a discarded canteen, but the metal was freezing to the touch. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. I could see my breath hitching in the air. Then I heard it, a faint, melodic whistle drifting through the thickening fog. It was a tune our mother used to hum to us when we were kids. "Elias!" I shouted, my voice cracking as it echoed off the damp rocks. There was no answer, just the whistle repeating, getting slightly louder, then fading away. The mist started to roll in fast, swallowing the trees and turning the world into a gray void. I felt a sudden primal urge to run back to the truck. I took shelter in one of the old pioneer cabins scattered throughout the park. The wood was gray and soft with rot, the windows nothing but dark, empty sockets. Inside, the air smelled of stale wood smoke and something metallic, like old blood. I sat in the corner, my back against the wall, clutching my knife. Every floorboard creak made my heart leap into my throat. I wasn't alone in here. I could feel the weight of a presence in the attic above. Just as I started to drift into a fitful sleep, the scratching began. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the other side of the logs I was leaning against. Slow, rhythmic, and deliberate, like a fingernail dragging across dry bone. I froze, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The sound moved upward, toward the ceiling, tracing the shape of the room. It was searching for a way in, or perhaps it was just letting me know it was there. In the morning light, I found a leather-bound journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. The pages were damp, the ink bleeding into Rorschach blots of black and blue. It belonged to Elias. The last entry was dated 3 days after he went missing. It wasn't a diary. It was a series of frantic warnings. "It mimics the things you love," he wrote. "If you hear me calling, run the other way." I left the cabin and followed a path of discarded clothing leading deeper into the ravine. A flannel shirt, a single hiking boot, a thermal undershirt, all of them torn but remarkably clean of blood. It was like he had simply unraveled as he walked. The woods grew tighter here, the branches interlacing like ribs. I found myself moving deeper into a part of the park that didn't appear on any of my maps. The birds had stopped singing entirely. I reached a small creek, the water running black and sluggish over smooth stones. As I knelt to wash the sweat from my face, I realized the stones weren't stones at all. The bed of the creek was lined with thousands of bleached white human teeth. They clicked together in the current, a dry, chattering sound that filled the ravine. I backed away, stumbling over a root, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't a forest. It was a graveyard. I saw him across a small clearing, Elias. He was standing with his back to me, wearing his favorite green jacket. Elias! Thank God! I screamed, rushing forward. He didn't turn around. He stayed perfectly still, his shoulders hunched. As I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. His arms were too long, his hands dangling near his ankles, and his neck seemed to be twisted at a 90-degree angle. He wasn't breathing. When the thing in the jacket finally turned, I didn't stay to see its face. I turned and bolted into the thicket, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear it behind me, not running, but moving through the brush with a terrifying, rhythmic thud. It was heavy, far heavier than a man. Every time I looked back, the fog seemed to pull closer, narrowing my world to a few feet of dirt and bark. I was being herded. I found a narrow fissure in a limestone cliff and squeezed inside, my chest scraping against the cold stone. The space was barely wide enough for me to breathe, but it was a fortress. Outside, the thudding stopped. Then the voice started again. It was my own voice this time, calling out from the woods, sounding terrified and hurt. Is anyone there? Please, help me. I'm scared. It was a perfect, sickening imitation of my own panic. I turned my light toward the back of the fissure and saw them. Hundreds of symbols carved into the limestone, some old and weathered, others fresh and weeping white dust. They weren't letters. They were depictions of things being pulled apart and put back together incorrectly. Someone had spent years in here, carving their madness into the stone. I realized then that Elias hadn't been the first, and I wouldn't be the last. A sudden scent of ozone filled the cave, like the air before a massive storm. The ground began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled my teeth. Outside, the woods went dead silent again. No voice, no thudding, just the hum. I felt a strange pulling sensation in my chest, as if my very soul was being tugged toward the back of the cave. There was something deeper in the dark, something that hadn't moved in centuries. I couldn't stay in that hole. I pushed myself out of the fissure, my skin raw and bleeding. The forest had changed. The trees were leaning at impossible angles, and the sky was a sickly, bruised yellow. I started walking toward where I thought the road was, but the compass on my watch was spinning wildly. I was in the heart of the gray place now, the spot where the maps end and the nightmares begin. I reached a grove where dozens of dolls were tied to the low-hanging branches of hemlock trees. They were made of sticks, cloth, and what looked like real human hair. Each one was dressed in scraps of clothing I recognized. A piece of Elias's backpack, a strip of my father's old hunting vest. They swung in a wind I couldn't feel, their button eyes staring into my soul. This was a warning. I was walking through a trophy room. In the distance, I heard the sound of a shovel hitting rocky soil. Clink, thud, clink, thud. It was coming from over the next ridge. I crawled through the laurel thickets, trying to remain unseen. When I reached the top, I saw a figure hunched over a fresh mound of earth. It was tall, dressed in tattered rags that looked like they were part of its skin. It wasn't using a shovel. It was digging with its bare, elongated claws. I watched in horror as the figure pulled something from the hole. It was a man, still alive, his mouth sewn shut with thick, black twine. He was thrashing weakly, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it made my own blood turn to ice. The creature didn't kill him. It simply laid him in a shallow trench and began to cover him back up, patting the dirt down with a strange, motherly tenderness. I had to move. I had to help him. As I shifted my weight to stand, a dry branch snapped under my boot. The sound was like a thunderclap. The digging creature froze. It didn't turn its head. Instead, its entire torso spun around 180 degrees with a sickening crackle of bone. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface with a vertical slit that began to pulse. I didn't wait for it to scream. I turned and ran, the sound of its clicking claws right on my heels. I found myself at the edge of a deep, stagnant pond. The water was the color of rusted iron and smelled of copper. I had no choice but to wade through it to reach the other side. The mud at the bottom felt like hands grabbing at my ankles, trying to pull me under. Halfway across, I felt something brush against my leg. Something cold, smooth, and very large. The water began to churn around me, bubbles of dark gas rising to the surface. I scrambled onto the muddy bank, gasping for air. The tall reeds surrounding the pond began to sway, even though there was no breeze. As they moved, they made a sound like 1,000 voices whispering secrets just out of reach. "Stay," they seemed to say. "Sleep. Join us in the deep." I covered my ears, but the voices were inside my head now. They knew my name. They knew my sins. I looked up and saw a figure perched in the high branches of a dead pine. It was dressed in the same gear I was wearing, the same pack, the same boots. It was looking at me, but it didn't have a face. Where the features should have been, there was only a hollow, black void. It pointed a long, bony finger toward the north, then vanished into the shadows of the needles. It was showing me the way, but I didn't trust it. I entered a part of the woods where the trees had been replaced by stone pillars that looked disturbingly like frozen people. They were captured in various states of agony, screaming, clutching their chests, trying to run. I touched one, expecting cold stone, but it felt warm. It was skin, hardened into a substance harder than granite. These weren't statues. They were the hikers who hadn't been fast enough. A high, piercing note echoed through the valley, the sound of a bone flute. It was a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in my marrow. The statues around me began to tremble, fine cracks appearing in their stone skin. I realized the music was waking them up, or perhaps it was calling the thing that fed on them. I started to climb the rocky slope, my fingers bleeding as I clawed at the shale. I reached a narrow stone bridge crossing a deep chasm. Beneath it, the mists were so thick I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear the sighs of 1,000 voices rising from the depths. As I stepped onto the bridge, the stones began to moan. I felt a hand grab my heel from beneath the gap between the rocks. I kicked out wildly, my heart nearly stopping as I looked down into the abyss. On the other side of the bridge stood a small, windowless church made of charred wood. The door was hanging off its hinges, revealing an interior lit by hundreds of black candles that gave off no light. I stepped inside, desperate for any kind of shelter. The pews were filled with figures made of twisted vines and thorns, all facing an altar where a large, black stone sat pulsing like a heart. I approached the altar and saw that the black stone was covered in names, etched deep into the surface. I found Elias's name near the bottom. It was glowing with a faint, sickly green light. Below it, a new name was being carved by an invisible hand. My name. The letters were forming slowly, the stone smoking as the name Caleb began to appear. I tried to rub it away, but the stone burned my hand. The thorn figures in the pews began to stand, their wooden joints creaking. They didn't have faces, but I could feel their collective gaze. They moved with a jerky, stop-motion gait, surrounding me. I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire building. The black candles flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. Then the whispering started again, much louder this time. I found the trapdoor just as the first thorn figure reached for my throat. I dived into the dark, falling down a steep wooden slide that dumped me into a tunnel of damp earth. The smell here was overpowering, the scent of 1,000 rotting corpses. I could hear the thorn figures scratching at the wood above, their long fingers probing the gaps. I crawled forward on my belly, the ceiling of the tunnel pressing against my back. The tunnel opened into a large underground chamber filled with the roots of a massive, ancient tree. The roots were translucent, and inside them, I could see things moving, small, pale embryos that looked vaguely human. This was the nursery. The forest wasn't just killing people. It was using them to grow something new. I saw Elias's hiking watch tangled in the roots, its digital display still blinking. I pressed my ear against the main root and heard a heartbeat. It was slow, deep, and echoed through the entire mountain. The earth itself was alive, and it was hungry. I realized that the entire Cades Cove Valley was just a giant mouth, and I was currently in its throat. The vibration grew stronger, and the embryos in the roots began to twitch. I needed to destroy this place, or I would never leave. I used my lighter to set fire to the dry moss hanging from the ceiling. The flames took hold quickly, the orange light revealing the true horror of the chamber. Thousands of bodies were woven into the walls, their faces part of the dirt. As the fire spread, the tree began to scream, a sound like 1,000 freight trains colliding. I scrambled back up the tunnel, the heat licking at my heels as the mountain groaned in pain. I burst out of the tunnel into a forest that was already on fire. The gray place was being consumed by an inferno of my own making. The trees were twisting in the heat, their bark peeling back like skin. I saw the tall, faceless creatures running through the flames, their bodies melting and bubbling. The air was filled with the smell of burning hair and resin. I ran toward the smoke, hoping it would lead me out. Finally, I saw it, the gravel road. It looked like a lifeline in the middle of a nightmare. I stumbled onto the path, my clothes charred and my skin blistered. The sun was coming up, but it was a pale, sickly thing behind the smoke. I looked back and saw the forest had stopped burning at the edge of the road. It was like there was an invisible barrier that the fire couldn't cross. I was safe, or so I thought. I reached the spot where I had parked my truck, but it was gone. In its place was a pile of rusted metal that looked like it had been sitting there for 50 years. The tires were rotted away, the engine block a nest for spiders. I checked my watch. It said I had only been gone for 2 days, but the world around me looked like a century had passed. I was still in the valley, but the valley had changed. I heard the sound of children laughing coming from the nearby woods. I turned to see 3 figures playing in the tall grass. They looked like children, but they moved with a fluidity that was wrong. Their skin was the color of river clay, and they had no eyes, only smooth, indentation-filled sockets. They stopped playing and looked at me, their mouths opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. I started walking down the road, but no matter how far I went, I always ended up back at the rusted truck. Cades Cove had become a loop, a closed circle of time and space. The children followed me from a distance, giggling and whispering. Every time I completed the loop, the world grew darker, and the trees grew closer to the road. The forest was reclaiming the path, inch by inch. I found a photograph lying in the middle of the road. It was a picture of me and Elias as kids, standing in front of this very spot. But in the photo, there was a third figure standing behind us. A tall, dark shape with long fingers resting on our shoulders. We were smiling, oblivious to the thing that had been with us since the beginning. I realized then that we hadn't stumbled into this place. We were born of it. A cabin appeared by the side of the road that hadn't been there before. It was a perfect replica of the house I grew up in. I walked to the front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The smell of my mother's cooking wafted from inside, chicken and dumplings. It was a trap, I knew it, but the hunger in my stomach and the cold in my bones were stronger than my fear. I stepped inside and saw them, my mother, my father, and Elias, all sitting around the kitchen table. They looked perfect, exactly as I remembered them, but they didn't move. They were like wax figures, their eyes fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table. "Sit down, Caleb," my father's voice said, but his lips didn't move. The voice came from the walls, from the floor, from the very air I breathed. I sat down and the table began to change. The plates of food turned into piles of maggots and rot. My family's faces began to melt, the skin sloughing off to reveal the gray, faceless things underneath. "You are home now," they whispered in unison. "The mountain has claimed its own." I felt my own skin starting to harden, my joints beginning to creak like old wood. I was becoming one of the statues. I looked at Elias. Underneath the gray skin, I could still see a glimmer of my brother. He reached out and grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Run," he mouthed. He wasn't one of them yet. Not entirely. He shoved me back, and the illusion of the house shattered. I was back in the dirt, the fire of the forest roaring in my ears. He had given me one last chance. I didn't waste it. I ran until the road ended at a massive cliff overlooking the entire Cades Cove valley. Below me, the valley was a sea of shifting shadows and flickering lights. I could hear the things behind me, their clicking claws and whistling voices closing in. There was no way back. I looked down at the sheer drop, then back at the nightmare I had escaped. The choice was simple: the mountain's hunger or the long fall. I didn't jump to die. I jumped to wake up. As I plummeted toward the mists, the world began to scream. The wind felt like cold fingers tearing at my clothes. Just before I hit the ground, the mists parted, revealing a mouth larger than the valley itself, lined with teeth the size of oak trees. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me, praying that death would be the end of the story. I woke up in a hospital bed in Knoxville. They told me I was found wandering the loop road, covered in scratches and babbling about a gray place. They said Elias is still missing. But sometimes, when the room is quiet, I hear a whistle from the hallway. And when I look in the mirror, my eyes aren't the color they used to be. The mountain didn't let me go. It just let me carry a piece of it back home.